ask you to move towards me for some closer fellowship. It would just, when I write on the newsprint and when we converse with one another, we'll all be in the same sacred space. So I apologize, but I appreciate your willingness to accommodate. Otherwise, someone will say, I can't say it. And this way we'll all be literally on the same page. Thank you. Plus, when I take a picture of all you, I can get you all in at one time.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Deacon Bertha sends her regards. She gets back into town tomorrow. So be praying for her safe travels. Thanks, everyone, for coming. This should just be a process for us to all learn about, what a search process looks like. I was, telling Dr. Johnson that we haven't been through a process in over 30 years. And so I think it's a good thing for all of us to sort of just learn, and the crowd we have here, is really those that were invited to the leaders retreat the last couple months ago. And so Dr. Jeff Johnson has been with us before. If you recall, he preached here on a Sunday morning. He wrote the book Got Style that we studied together for several weeks. And it is his role within the American Baptist denomination that is principally responsible for working with churches in their search process. His official title, I believe, is the Regional Pastor with Congregations, American Baptist Churches of Pennsylvania and Delaware, and the Director of Evangelism and New Church Plans for the American Baptist Home Mission Societies. And so, with that, I'm not going to extend the time too much more. I'm going to be sort of in and out. I'm on a conference call as well for the Commission on Ministerial Leadership, and I'm going to try to do my best to sort of be in both places. So, Dr. Jeff is going to kick us off. I'm not sure if you want to open up with a word of prayer.
Sure. Good evening, Union.
Good evening.
What a privilege it is to be with you tonight and journey with you now in the days ahead as you search for another seated permanent pastor. This is an exciting time. This is an exhausting time. This is a time that can create some anxiety, but it's also a time to create great anticipation. For the same God that founded this church with those members years ago is still the longest serving member here in this congregation. God has not left the house.
Amen.
And so as God has had a plan in the past, God has a plan for the present, and God has a plan for the future. And it is not the responsibility of this congregation to come up with that plan, because who could come up with anything that would appease the Almighty? It is our responsibility, because God, John chapter 6, God already has in mind what He's going to do. It's this congregation's responsibility to discern and discover that, and then act upon the information through that process that you have received. And God is a God who works in processes. He works behind us. Remember, your future is God's past. You are not walking anywhere where God has not already been. And so your responsibility is make sure you don't get off the path. To make sure you stay on the way. Because God has laid that out for you. And so as we begin our time together, before we start talking to each other, let's spend a moment talking to God. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day that you've given us. for the rain that refreshes the earth, and your Spirit that renews our spirits. I thank you for these folks that have come out this evening. Many of them have come directly from their places of work. And so I thank you for them coming to the church house without even going to their house. And I ask that whatever tasks and responsibilities they have laid aside for these minutes that we are in this meeting, that you will bless them for it. And that you will multiply them back that time so they can accomplish the task that they have put off for the moment. And maybe give them some wisdom to not even start something that you didn't even want them to begin in the first place. And by coming here, they're able to let that go. We do thank you for being among us tonight. There'd be no reason for us to show up if you hadn't shown up. And we thank you for being among us, for leading us, and for guiding us in these days ahead, believing very much that you have already placed your hand upon that person and pastor that you want to call to this congregation. And so it is not our responsibility to seek that individual, but rather to seek your face. Not that person, but your plan. And so let us settle for nothing less, Lord Jesus, than us keeping our eyes on you. And when we do so, we'll see where your eyes land. We'll see where your eyes look. And we'll know that's the direction that we ought to go. And so, Lord, again, thank you for being present with us in all the experiences, individually and congregationally, of our lives. In this we give you thanks. Your strong name. Amen. Amen. Okay. What I'd like to do this evening is talk you through the process that is used in our system for the seeking and securing of potential candidates, and from those candidates, a pastor. I'm hoping that as we do this together, like family does, I want you to feel free as family to interrupt me. To say, hey, wait a minute, I have a question. I'll try to remember to give us opportunities for that as we move along. But if there's something that pricks your spirit, that something that causes a question or a quandary in your mind, then let's address it at that point. You can write it down if you want. We'll come back to it. But again, I don't want those thoughts to be lost in our time of sharing with one another this evening. Okay? Let me say this first and foremost. Hear me, Union, loud and clear. The thing that you should be doing above and beyond anything and everything else is now entering into a time of dedicated prayer. And I know the church is already praying, but I am talking about setting aside, literally, a moment every single day. Now you can do this various ways. You can do it based upon, in your case, it doesn't work very well because the street address is 3117, right? 2117. That explains why my GPS sent me where it did. But that won't work, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. We could use the area code for here, which is 412, right? Okay? Or we could use the year that you're beginning your search, which is 2017, which in military time would be 8/17, because what we're looking for is a time in the morning and a time at night when all the church, no matter where you are, pauses in that moment and prays. Now, I'm with you if you go with the 8:17 in the morning, 8:17 in the evening. Otherwise, if you go with the 412 for your area code, I'll pray in the afternoon, but I am dead to the world at 412 in the morning. But if there are some brothers and sisters dedicated to rise up in that fourth watch of the night, then we'll go with that. But you want to pick a time where literally the church is reminded, no matter where they are, to stop and for a moment pray. Because I want to say two things about that. One, you get what you pray for. And secondly, there is no use talking to any potential candidates if you aren't first talking to God. I'm just going to lay it out there. You can do what you want with that, But I think if you go that direction where we'll handle it, we'll do it, then don't hold God responsible for the outcome. Because those who know what God wants to do spend time in God's presence. When I hear somebody say, individually or congregationally, Dr. Jeff, I don't know what to do, I tell them immediately, you aren't spending enough time in God's presence. Because you can't be in God's presence and God not bring up what is important to God. Especially in this regard in Union, seeking a new seated permanent pastor. God's going to bring it up because God knows it matters to you and it matters to God. So if you're not hearing that, you're not listening enough. So we set aside this daily time for prayer. So that wherever the church is, and in our Baptist tradition, this beautiful structure is not the church. In our Baptist tradition, it is anywhere any of you are any time of the day. That's where the Church of Union Baptist Swissvale at 2117 Collinwood Street is located. And just think about the power of that. If in the morning as people are rising up and heading out, or close to the end of the day, the Spirit of God is all over this county, and maybe some of you that come from outside of it, connecting this congregation together for that power. Listen, that's going to cause God to take notice. Because God is saying that congregation is taking this process seriously. Now, there's a second prayer practice that we recommend. So, the first prayer practice is what we call the collective prayer, right? And that's the daily time designated however the church leadership wishes to do this. I gave you a few examples. You can think of maybe others. But a second one is the corporate. And the corporate is what we see as the leadership of the church. And that is, from this point on, I would suggest that every single board, committee, and group in the congregation, whenever they are meeting, tithe their meeting time. Because that new pastor is going to be working with all these groups in the church. So each body within the body ought to be praying about that individual that's going to be filling right now an empty seat. Actually, it's not empty because Dr. Friday many times in many ways is filling that. But the reality is that that group, the trustees, the deacons, the deaconesses, because are they two separate boards or one? So Diaconate Board, Board of Christian Ed, Board of Missions, all those other things, women's group, men's group, whoever meets should tithe their meeting time. And they front load that, which means that when they come together, the trustee board says, the chair, how long are we going to meet? Well, normally they're about 2 hours long, so you tithe 12 minutes up front. Now, what some groups do is they actually take it by the hour. Because by 7 to 8, they have a watch person, like the scripture talks about in Ezekiel, a watch person who monitors the time and says, oh, it's 8 o'clock, and then they pause and they pray for 6 minutes again for that hour. Now, some do that so that they constantly can be centered on Christ. But another reason to do that is to make sure Jesus didn't leave the room. Because if he did, there's no use everybody else staying. If he's left, you might as well go too. Right? Okay, so you dedicate that time. Now, I have found in my own local church work, when I was a senior pastor of a multiple staff congregation, that what that often did was, it first of all, people that came, many of you like tonight, who came directly from work and had to work with the hassle of the weather and the public transportation and the traffic on 376 and all those other things, it helps to center you. Secondly, for those, and I know that's not the case ever here at Union, but there are congregations this is true of, my friends. People come to meetings with preconceived agendas. Now again, I know that never happens here. Never. But hear me for the sake of others that aren't present, that we should share this wisdom with. And that is that it diffuses that. Because where they came in ready to jump right in, they've got to wait. And as the Spirit of God fills the room and fills the people in it, that kind of stuff gets pushed to the margins. And really only the stuff of Christ remains. Okay? So I would encourage the corporate practice of tithing your meeting times. You can even break it into half hour, however, but it should be front, and you can do it different ways. You can just have 12 minutes of silent prayer. Or you can have 12 minutes of popcorn prayer where whoever feels prompted to leads in prayer. You can have concert prayer where everyone prays at the same time out loud. You can designate one person to start, close. However you do it, it is not about the methodology, it's about the mentality. God, we are taking this seriously. And I'm telling you, if you are not talking to God first, don't even receive a resume. Because you're going to be working in the flesh and not in the Spirit. Because don't ever forget something. And some of you have probably been members here longer than I've been alive. This is still God's church, no one else's. Amen. See, I can speak with immunity because I'm leaving town tonight. And on an airplane tomorrow. But if I get too meddling, I might be made to leave sooner. But I'm telling you, this is God's house. And I said it in the beginning, and I mean it. There's been one member who has been consistently here since the day this church was founded, and that is only God and God alone. Amen. The rest of us, by God's grace, have been able to join in on that. What a privilege that is. What a blessing that is. But when it comes down to it, when you have those people say, I've been a member however long, no one has been here longer than God. So he gets first and foremost place. So we consult him above and beyond everybody else. And again, this goes back to this idea. No use talking to each other, even on a board or a committee, unless we're talking to God's first. Because it's God's boards. It's God's committees. It's God's teams. It's God's groups. Then the third prayer practice is personal. And this is where we encourage every member and attender. Because you probably have people that show up on Sunday but haven't yet been moved by the Spirit to move their membership here or to come forward and be baptized and identify as a member. But they're still, if you ask them, who's your family, they'd say Union Baptist Swissvale. And there are more members, really, than some people you got on your roll that haven't shown up here in years. So they too should be included in these because that's going to be their pastor also. And though they may not have a vote, and probably won't according to your constitution, you'll be voting on their behalf. They should participate because that's going to be their pastor. Like that person is going to be your pastor. So we encourage everyone to tithe their personal prayer time. And we're making no judgments. You pray 3 hours a day, which is the equivalent of 180 minutes, right? You tithe 18 minutes a day. And that 18 minutes is devoted to just the search process. So you've got prayer going on out in the streets, where people might be at those times, 8 at night, 8 in the morning. You've got prayer going on in the church house, and you've got prayer going on in your house. You have covered all the bases. But I would encourage you to take these suggestions seriously. Because you will get what you pray for. Sometimes God doesn't answer, I think, because he knows we're really not listening. So why would he waste his breath? But when he knows that we are doing all we can to tune in, God speaks. And I believe that God still, if I didn't believe God still speaks today, people wouldn't get saved. Because they're not saved because of what I say. They are saved because of what God says to their heart about their need for that personal relationship with him.
That's right.
So the reality is, God has to still speak, or people aren't going to become Christians today. And if God speaks to people that way to become Christians, He's going to continue to speak to us as we live out our lives as Christians, individually and congregationally. And that is true here as well. Listen, I keep this up. We're going to turn this into a revival.
Amen. Come on now.
Okay. Let's stop there and ask for any comments, questions, insights, input, anything? Yes.
How do you assess where you are with that process? How does the church do that? How can we check to make sure that that's
Well, this is the responsibility. This primarily would come out of the Deactivate Board, because they are the spiritual overseers of the congregation, the he's and the she's that form that group of ministry, correct? In Union Baptist. And since that doesn't mean that all of us shouldn't be praying. This isn't just a practice of the Deactivate Board, but because they are the spiritual overseers, they're the ones that usually prompt this. And what you do is you begin to promote it in every way possible. Through your Sunday bulletin, if you do a newsletter, if you have and you do have an online website, however you can put that out. It even can be set up on somebody's phone to put everybody's phone numbers into a group. Instant messaging, and 8:16, 8:17, it comes out to everybody. Just as there are congregations I'm literally with when that happens, and you'll hear phones go off. And I've been out to dinner with lay people, and we just stopped and prayed for that moment. Doesn't have to be anything elaborate or long. It's just like God. And again, I think the power is all the people that are doing it at that moment in time. God, we are looking for your person to be our pastor. That's what we're looking for. But again, the group puts it out, and then people own it. Will you get everybody to participate? Probably not. Will you get some to do some? Yes. Will you get some to do all? Absolutely. But it is the responsibility to give of the spiritual leadership of the church to give people spiritual opportunities. And that's what you're doing with this. And again, the tithing makes no judgment. If a person prays 3 minutes or 3 hours, no judgments. Because we're not asking them to mark it down on a piece of paper. We're just saying, would you covenant with us to tithe your prayer time? Whatever that might be, and the last studies that were put out show that the average church member prayed how many minutes a day, would you say? 15? Any others? 10, 20, 4. And the average pastor? 7. So could that explain the state of the American church today? Because how can you be talking to others about God if you aren't talking to God about others?
That's true.
Where's the motivation going to come from? From us? Most of us didn't even care about our own spiritual condition. And God had to come get us. God had to seek us. We were sought after. Because we weren't looking out for ourselves in many other ways, but not a spiritual way. And so the reality is that no judgments, but we just simply say, whatever you are praying, 3 minutes, 3 hours, just tithe that time and use it for this purpose. Other thoughts?
So is it official from 2017?
Oh, I will defer that to your diaconate board to discuss and decide. Because maybe there's another number that would resonate with you. It's clear that though you're beginning your process in 2017, it is unlikely that you won't secure a pastor until 2018. And I say that simply because we're 1 month out from Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year. Doesn't it seem like just yesterday we were saying Happy Easter to everybody? And here we're getting ready to say Merry Christmas. Where did this year go? Like that. And they say the older you get, which by the way, the older I get, the older old gets. Like you've got to be in your triple digits now for anything. Once you pass that half-century mark, it gets pushed way out there. But the reality is it just goes, they tell me the older you get, the faster it goes. It is like a blur now. So I can't imagine my head will just be in a constant spinning motion 5 years from now. But the reality is that you'll be going into 2018. Because even if there were viable candidates at this point, I mean, even if today one showed up on your doorstep and they were serving in another church, most congregations require 60 to 90 days notice, which would put them to the end of the year. So even if they were primed and ready to go today and started January the 1st, it still would be 2018. So, I mean, think about it. If you start talking to pastors and you're getting to Thanksgiving, you're getting to Advent, you're getting to Christmas, and you say to them, do you have time to talk? And they say, anytime, I'm available, I'm not doing nothing. Is that the kind of pastor you want? I mean, if they say day or night, except for that 1 hour Sunday morning, I am available, you say, move on down the road. Right? I mean, they should tell you, listen, I can't talk to you till January, and it won't be till the second week of January, because I'll be recovering from everything, from that if they do it right. This is one of the most spiritually fertile seasons of the year, when people can be reached with the gospel because Emmanuel has come among us. What greater thing do you have to give thanksgiving for? And so the reality is that, again, so even though we would start it now, it could go into next year, and I don't know how long into next year, so the reality is that it may be more of 2018 than it is 2017, but this is clearly the year you would start, as we're doing tonight.
So we're going to make it official 2018?
I'll defer, because I think it should be a consensus among your diaconate. And I confess, with the exception of Pastor Les, I don't know what boards or committees you serve on, so I'll just speak generically, and then you can apply personally. Any others with these? Okay, then let's say we've been doing this for about a month, 2, okay? Or 3. During that time, the church is going to do several things. First of all, you're going to form a search committee, which you don't have right now, right? Okay. So you'll form the search committee, and that committee will work directly with me and an associate adjunct that we have in the greater Pittsburgh area. And so what we will then begin to do is I'm going to lay out for all of you what I would normally just tell the search committee, so that all of you will be aware of the process, even though you won't be all involved in the process. You will through the practices of prayer, but not the actual details of the search. Now let me say this, a search process is not secret, but it is sacred. Because you are dealing with the life of a congregation and the life of a pastor. And so what is shared should be kept confidential. And if you can't be confidential, then you shouldn't be on the committee. But don't you make that judgment. Ask someone else, do you think I'm confidential? And if they tell you no, then don't accept being on the committee. I'm telling you, I've seen churches and pastors damaged because people won't stop talking about what should be done, not in secret, but in sacred. It is a trust of the body being given to a select group to lead them in a certain direction. And so we must take that responsibility very seriously. Okay, so the search committee is formed. One of the first things I do is come to the committee and say to them, we're working in a vacuum. We need information. And so that committee begins to gather information from the congregation. There will be 2 assessments that are done by the committee. One of the committee itself, and then one of the congregation. And one of the things that I use that for is to see how representative the committee is of the congregation. Because if the results don't sync, then the committee needs to work through that and say, why is it that the congregation listed these 8 things as the priority for the pastor, but the committee listed these 6 things. And between the list, only 2 are the same. So we go back to say, what's up here? So that when we start using that information to garner resumes, profiles as we call them in our system, the reality is that we know that that group is not only one in mind with God and one in mind with each other, but one in spirit with the congregation that they represent. So we do these 2 assessments. Those assessments help us to know what is the expectation for the next pastor. Now, what will sometimes play out in those assessments is this. People in the church will select from this list of 36 that we will provide. It's a 1-page sheet that you'll put, and do you do forgive me for not remembering, do you do a church bulletin every Sunday? Thank you. So you'll copy this, and for like 3 or 4 weeks, because not everybody's here every single Sunday. But the largest number of people that identify with Union Swissvale are here on Sunday. There's probably no other gathering during the week when you have most of the congregation represented than on Sunday mornings. Right? So we want to poll them several weeks in a row, just to be sure that we've gotten the best coverage. Now you say to people, we're really only looking for 1 assessment from each person. But there may be a couple that get a little excited and try to stuff the ballot box. But we'll leave that to God and won't police the assessments. But what we then do is gather them together and take the 8 highest that are picked, that have over a 50% margin of acceptance. Because that's what we require in a Baptist church. 50% majority for something to pass. Because that tells us that's a pretty good consensus of the congregation as to what people want. But what you'll get is sometimes one of 2 reactions. They'll pick everything their last pastor was, because they want to replicate those ministry priorities, or they will pick in reaction to what the last pastor was and select everything different. When what we're really, remember, we don't do those assessments until there's been this period of prayer. This oneness of spirit. Believing that God can work in the ballot box of these assessments to give us the information that will move us in the direction of our discernment process. So we gather that information together, and then there's other information that both the congregation and the committee will decide. So we have the assessments, right? 2 of them. One for the congregation and one for the committee. Is that what you call yours, a search committee, or is it called something else? Search committee? Okay, so we do that. And then what we do, and remember, these are ministry priorities. In other words, and just to give you an example, it is a 1-page sheet that lists, like preaching, pastoral care, evangelism, Christian education, laity development, leadership, interpreting the faith, ecumenical, working with other churches in the community, youth ministry, music ministry. So there's 36 of those. Now some may add more, but we use those 3 dozen, and what you look for is the top 8. Okay? So ministry priorities. Because as you're selecting them to represent your church, there are pastors out there that use our system that are selecting them, saying these are the 8 things, or up to 8 things, that I think I do the best. So we plug your information into a computer system, we plug their information into the same computer system, and it's like eharmony.com for churches. Where we match up their priorities with your priorities, but then there's also some other things we want to know. The committee and the congregation will provide level of education. How much learning, schooling do you want them to have? High school, is that sufficient? Maybe a regional school of ministry like we have here in APCAPAD for licensed lay pastors, certified lay ministers. Do you want them to have, which would be the equivalent of like a 2-year associate degree. Do you want them to have a 4-year Bible college degree? Do you want them to have some level of graduate religious education? A Master's of Ministry, which is the first year of graduate school, a Master's of Religion, which is the second year, or which is our standard, the Master's of Divinity. Or do you desire, as some churches do, to have a doctorate level? But you will determine that. And the less that you specify, the more profiles, resumes you're going to get, but then you may be spending a lot of time looking at individuals that you'll never really consider. So it is often better to first start with less, and then later, depending on who comes out of the system or who doesn't, to add more. But if you go too broad, that's that exhausting part I talked about, where you're reading so many, looking at so much, it just becomes a blur. Now, I will say this too. When people hear that Union Swissvale is open, some will already start sending their resumes. What you should do is take those and put them in a folder and set them aside for now. Because you don't want to look at them until you have defined all of this information. Otherwise, you're letting a person drive your search and not your purposes. You are allowing an individual, well, you know, we read that individual's papers, and man, it just seems like we ought to go in that direction. But is that the direction God wants us to go? Because this is where we're asking the congregation, we believe God speaks, but God speaks through His Word, God speaks through other people, so God tell us what this ought to be. Okay? So education. Another one is experience. And my marker is, may I ask if someone could, I brought one with me, but it is giving up the ghost. Well, bless you. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Okay, so experience. Now this could be, normally if we say 0 to 5, it means that you could get an individual just coming out of seminary. With the timing of your consideration could be a possibility, because this probably will be taking the rest of this year and the very first part of next year. Seminarians will be graduating in May-ish, and so it is possible that their names could come up in the system if you said, we'll take someone just starting out from scratch. But when a church does that, they've got to be ready to demonstrate grace. Because they're coming rough around the edges. Now, some, especially, who are coming from second careers into school and then coming out, are coming with experience, but not religious experience, which at times butts heads with the church, because if you look at their history, they spent more time sitting in the pew than they did standing in the pulpit, and so they understand how the church works, because that's where they came out of. But regardless of right from the get-go, or someone who's been in another career and it's called the ministry, you call someone new, and you got to be willing to extend grace, because they'll make mistakes. They're going to live, they're going to learn as they live. It's that simple. But remember, we're not perfect either.
Amen.
We've been around for a while, and we still got rough edges too. Okay? But experience. Normally you go from 0 to 5, 0 being just coming out of school, and up to 5 means that 5 years that they've had at least one church. If you go 5 to 10, it means that they probably have had 2 churches. Like, had one, and maybe they're in the second one. Now, if you go 5 to 10, and you get their profile, and it says that they, in 10 years, have had 6 churches. Moving on down the road. Join that other group. Just follow them. Because we're moving on. 10 to 20 normally means they've had at least 2 churches. Normally. Could be just one as well, but 2 churches. And by 10, we consider that seasoned. Especially if they've been in 2 churches. Worked out, if you will, some of the bugs in the first congregation, in their own selves, and worked out the bugs the people in the pew, and then God's called them to somewhere else, and that's where they really oftentimes flourish and thrive. So again, and then over 20. But now remember, if you're talking over 20, because what everyone wants is someone with 30 years of experience, but that's 22 years old. Because we want to reach young people. The church needs young people. So we want someone who's 22 years old, but they got to have 30 years experience that they're bringing to the table. So unless they were like Jeremiah, called in the womb and stayed in there for 15 years before they came out to then carry on their prophetic ministry, you're not going to find them. And let's be honest about it. You put Paul's resume on a piece of paper and not put his name on the top, and you'd reject him outright as your next pastor. You look at some of the stuff he did, and you'd say, no way. And then someone would lift the tab and go, oh, the Apostle Paul, sorry. But think about it. Hey, listen. You put Jesus' resume and cover up his name. And there'd be churches that reject him.
That's right. That's true. Yeah.
Because of who he hung out with, some of the things he said, some of the things he did, they tell him, no way. And then they go, oops. Okay? So experience. Now in our system, when the search committee gets a profile, in the upper right-hand corner, and by the way, these profiles can look very complicated because they contain a lot of information about the individual. And so I help to walk you through that when you first begin to get them, so you know where to read about the education, you know where to read about their past experiences, you know where to read about their own priorities that they have selected, where they think they're good. Even the resumes give people in their lives the opportunity to speak into their lives. When they say, I think I'm a fairly good preacher, some people will mark on the form, no, we really think they're an exceptional preacher. Or some people will say, they might think more highly of themselves than they ought to. But that would be laid out for the committee to see. But the resumes can have in the upper right-hand corner of them, and they're an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. In the upper right-hand corner, it can say one of four things. One, open to move, which means that that individual is ready to go to another church if they were called. That they believe that God has used them in the place where they are, or have been, and that God wants them somewhere else. Okay? The second one is might consider, which means that they are really, or at least okay, happy with where they're at. They think things are good. They see no reason necessarily to leave their present field of service, but they still want to be open to what God wants. And so they don't want to say to God, I'm staying here out of convenience. They want to stay at a place because of their conviction. That that's where God wants them to be. Now a third category you actually won't see, and resumes you won't receive, and those are people who have been removed from the system because of certain unsatisfactory behaviors. And that's done by the committee that Pastor Les is actually meeting with, and I'm usually on that call as well, but felt meeting with you all at Union tonight was equally important, and spoke to the chair and said, I really think I should be there in Swissvale. And so Les is on that call as a representative, but that's the committee that examines our ministerial people, our ministers, and make sure that they stay where they are, and not necessarily in placement, but in their walk with the Lord and within their professional. And when they don't, that's the group that deals with them. Now there is one other group of resumes that I say, and that is, should have left here yesterday. Should have gotten out last week. But actually, you won't see those resumes either, but they could be in the open to move. That's why you have to flesh that out when you're talking with them. Why are you open to move? Well, if they tell you, I really do believe that God has used me like Moses to take his people to a certain point in time, and now there's someone else that he has ordained and appointed to take them further, that's one thing. If they begin to tell you about the difficulties, the squabbles, the fights, the contentions, then you need to work through that and say, well, what's all that about? Because we don't want baggage being brought over. That doesn't mean that we expect any pastor to be perfect, because we're not perfect. And every pastor came out of the pew. At some point or another, God's called every pastor out of the pew. He has dropped none from heaven. So they all started where we all are. And so none of us are perfect. But the reality is that we flesh that out and say, so what's going on? But that, I'm being honest with you, Union, there could be those that are in difficult situations, but there's no way to say that. But that's still a grouping that could appear, but most likely would appear under the open to move. Either they're finished, or they are finished. That's that category. Okay? So that's experience. Okay? A third one then is, a third one would then be, of course, compensation. And I say that to you because Union doesn't have a parsonage, do they? You provide a housing allowance. Okay? So what you do here is, there's 3 bits of information that are critical mass. That would be salary, housing allowance, and Social Security offset. Did you provide that as well? Okay. And some churches do, some churches don't. It is half of what the Social Security would be, like an employer would pay on behalf of an employee. But as you may be aware, ministers are caught between two. On one hand, ministers are seen by the Internal Revenue Service as self-employed individuals, contracted laborers. Therefore, they're expected to pay themselves the Social Security rate at a higher level. Because if something happens to them, there's not necessarily another employee in a factory or a plant or a company to step in and keep paying into the system for what they're being paid when they can't be in the system. Do you follow me? But then they're also considered employees. And so because of that, a church is allowed to set aside a certain amount of money to pay for what is normally around 7.6% of what is a 15.2% Social Security rate for a self-employed individual. Now, what really is important here is what the total dollar amount will be. Because when you begin to work with a pastor, they may have other employment, their spouse may have employment through which they receive benefits, and therefore that's not going to be an expense per se that the church will incur or carry, or their spouse may be covered, but they, adding a little bit to their spouse's insurance, will be covered. Do you follow me? And so all of those come under the benefit line, but could affect this collective total. But this is what's important. When the church makes the decision of what the compensation will be, the church will not, through our system, receive a resume that doesn't fall within those parameters. So, because there's nothing more frustrating than looking at a candidate only to find out that you are thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars apart. To say, boy, we really like you, and the individual says, boy, we really like the church, but there's just too great a gulf between that. Very frustrating. And we all got to be paid something. Labor is worthy of his hire, the scripture says. So this number is what we plug in. We don't plug in your highest. So what you give us is a number, and then as the committee, working with myself and my adjunct, we start incrementally. Right? And again, because they may come and say, listen, my spouse works, and so we're going to use their income as what we live off of, but I want you to put the majority of my pay into the housing allowance, which allows for deductions that congregational members aren't eligible for, but that came about decades and decades and decades ago when pastors were living in parsonages, and maybe Union had one at one point, did they? But when pastors lived in parsonage and they retired, they had no place to go. And they hadn't banked anything, and they had no equity, they had no income, they had no assets set aside, and they were destitute. So the government stepped in and said, we'll allow you this benefit, though I confess to you right now in the Wisconsin Supreme Court, this is being debated as to whether or not it is legal, because is the government fostering religion by permitting this? So far, it has been proven by the courts as yes, they are allowed because of our work status, not because of what we do as our work. But they may ask this number to be higher than the salary. That's why you don't want to attach certain figures to any one of these three. You just want to give me a cumulative total, and then we'll break it down as we're in conversation with each individual. Questions? Input? Comments? Yes?
Is there, from your standpoint, an optimal number of people on the search committee? Or this should be on the search committee?
Well, that's often debated. First, I'll answer it in a generic form and say it's debated, should we have an even or an odd number to allow for a decision to be made with a majority? If the whole committee's not together, you should never send a candidate to the congregation. If there is not, and not just consensus, but commitment to the candidate, they should never be brought to the church. If there is a dissenting voice or vote among the committee, then the committee needs to work on why that is. So I say that to say, it doesn't matter if it's odd or even, right? If you're in agreement that everyone has to agree. Otherwise they don't come. Because if they come and people begin to raise from the congregation, well, what about, you could have a committee member say, you know, I tried to bring that up at the meeting last week, but the people wouldn't listen to me. And you go, well, now wait a second. Aren't you as a committee in agreement on this? Well, most of us are. Some of us are just willing to let it slide. You don't pick a pastor because you just let it slide. You pick them because you believe that's who God wants you to have. So with that said then, I would say less is more. I don't mean Pastor less, I mean less with two S's. So less is more, but that's not what I'm talking about. Less is more, only because, I mean, Jesus worked with 12 and had a very difficult time. And I'm not always sure he was thrilled about it. So I would not recommend a committee of 12. It gets too laborious. Because if you get too many, trying to get them all together can be very difficult. And if people start missing meetings, you miss one, then they miss one, you got to keep bringing people up to speed. And no one really is ever brought totally up to speed that isn't present when things are happening. So I'm good. I mean, if you want a number, though I don't have one, sister, I would say that when, and this is a unique thought, what created leadership in the early church was not that ministry was going gangbuster. It was a conflict. Because they went to the apostles and said, something's not being done right. And the apostles said, then pick 7 leaders. Right? So it was conflict that created leadership, not the abundance of ministry. And let those leaders then handle it. So I'm saying, sister, if 7 was good enough for the early church to get things going, 7 would probably be fairly representative of union. Now you'll have to decide that. What I think is more important is the makeup of that committee. And that committee should be representative. When I sit down with that committee for the first time, I ought to be seeing the face, not faces, the face of Union Swissville. And by that, I mean gender, I mean age, I mean membership length. You ought to have people on that committee who have been here 20 plus years. And maybe there's some of you that remember when that pastor was picked 30 some years ago, and then transition was made internally from one to another, that you didn't have to go through a formal process, right? So some of you should remember that. There should be people on that committee that don't remember that. You follow me? Some who have been at this church 0 to 5 years. Some who have been at this church 5 to 10 years. Some who have been here 10 to 20 years. Some who sat in the pew with Moses. Okay? Or Sarah. Or Abraham. Okay? I mean, you ought to bring the perspective. None of you. But you ought to bring, you follow me? It ought to be inclusive of the congregation. It ought to be, male, female. It ought to be intergenerational. It ought to be multicultural. It ought to be inclusive of the years of membership that people are here. All of that should be, because when I go around with the committee the first time, those are the kind of things. Some I'll see with my own eyes. Female, male, younger, older. But I'm going to ask them questions like, how long have you been here? What group do you represent? And remember, there will be likely representation from given groups like there'll probably be a representative or two from the diaconate, a representative or two from the trustees. Those are critical because the diaconate will go back and continue to monitor the spirituality of the church through the process, being able to speak into it, right? But the trustees are helpful because I assume they're the body that makes the financial decisions of the congregation, and they'll be necessary to help facilitate this aspect of it. And if you have to keep pulling people in that can't speak into that, it just makes it twice as laborious. But again, the majority of the church is probably in the pews and not on the board, so they should be represented to a large degree on the committee. Others, yes?
As far as the salary, do you also do salary minimums and maximums by the congregation's size?
Yes. And what we often look at there is giving units. And what presently the giving units are, what potentially the giving units could be. We even may project out the possibilities of increase under the new leadership, but we never ever see potential folks coming into the church as dollar signs. But we do see them as potential supporters of the work, which could enhance the number that we might propose, projecting that out. And that's some of the information that I'll be gathering through the committee, because as pastors have put together their profile with this information, you'll be putting together a profile of what Union Swissvale is like. So that when you read someone's resume and say, here's 5 people we wish to contact, you have something to give them. I will not give you a resume until you give me a church profile. Because if you say, well, we're working on it, well, that could still be 2 months in the taking. That whole list of candidates could change during that period of time. Because those individuals could be called somewhere. Or what has happened is I've called candidates and they say, my mother-in-law fell and broke her hip. And now we're going to have to stay here because she's going to need my wife or my husband, if it's a female pastor, to help take care of them. So a month can change for sure, 2 months, a lot of things. So unless you provide me a profile, and I'll give the committee samples to work from to know what information should be included there, like the demographics of your area, the demographics of the congregation, and so forth, what the church is presently doing, what the church's aspirations are, what we'd like to do. That way, as soon as you tell me, these 5 I want to know. And by the way I've been doing it, you won't receive a profile that I first haven't contacted the individual to say, are you available? And to say to them, are you in a search process with another church? Because you don't want them 3/4 of the way in a search process with another church. You start looking at their resume only to find out when you say yes, they say no. Frustrating. So we try to prevent that as much as possible. Now, I will be honest with you, Union, very transparent. Just recently, what I've done with 6, right now, I am responsible to work with congregations across all of Pennsylvania and Delaware. But I have direct oversight and shepherding responsibility of our churches from Altoona to the Ohio border, from Erie to West Virginia. About 100 and some churches. Right now, 10% of them are looking for pastors. So what I just did is so that committees know I'm not keeping anybody from them. I punched in all their criteria for 6 of these committees and just gave them the profiles. I didn't make any calls ahead of time. I didn't tell them who was available, who wasn't. I just told them as a committee, you sit down and look through these, pick out the ones you want, then we'll talk about those individuals. Some of them, as I just looked today in an email before I came to be with you, some of those aren't viable candidates. They've been called somewhere else. They're not able to meet the expectations of the congregation, even though they have expressed that they can, their experience tells us otherwise. And so, and I don't see myself doing that with you to begin with, because I want you to first work with those who have said we are available. And I say to them, how about southwestern Pennsylvania? We don't give them any particulars, but yes, I'm good with living in that area. More urban than rural, yes, I'm good with that as well. Those kind of things.
My question might go back to the assessment, but if we wanted a person to have a physical or something like that before they were hired, like to help with the person that be on the assessment.
Well, we will require a background check, because it's just required now. If a pastor interacts in the presence of children, or any really church volunteer, they are expected, as we have, both federal and state clearances, because of our summer camps, because of our retreats, because of our conferences, just because it's showing up. No, I'm saying to you, not only is that possible, but there are some churches even requiring financial reviews, credit checks. Not that they, and I'm not, that's a decision, I'm just putting that out there, and you decide what you want to do with it. But we know that there are a lot of people today up against it, not just ministers. And that can be very taxing on a clergy family and a congregation when they come carrying certain levels of debt that no one knew about going into it. That can be distracting, it can be even debilitating to ministry. And so the church can say, we have certain expectations, like background checks, like physical checks. Now there are privacy issues, obviously, with HIPAA, as the credit is as well. What you simply say, are there red flags here that we should be aware of? And we tell candidates, when we talk with them when they go into our system, listen, be transparent. Because you get into the process and something comes out that you weren't honest about, it's over with them. Because it will always leave them wondering, is there something else? And you just don't go there. That's not how you should. No one should start a relationship on the principle of what can I keep from you, more than let me share this. But yes, there can be. Every congregation committee can be different, but you can make that expectation. Some may say no.
That is done on Pennsylvania.
On what?
On
The background checks? Yes, that's done. We can do that through us, submitting them for that process. Because they're going to need it anyways. And we, as a region, really take that seriously. Having people check and use the search process as a means to do that, because we want to do due diligence. We've lived in an area, my friends, where too many bad things have happened. And we can't prevent it all, but we should do what we can to prevent as much as possible. Other thoughts? Now I tell people there are at any given time across this country in the American Baptist family about 500 churches looking for pastors. And at the same time, there's 500 churches that wish they were looking for pastors. And pastors that were wishing they were looking for churches. So it goes both ways. But the reality is there's some that geography will not appeal to them. So some are immediately going to be ruled out. Just because they say, that's not where I want to live, both geographically or urban setting-wise, and so forth. And all that gets fleshed out in the information that you provide. And so we put as much in to get as many as we possibly can to come out. But again, the critical mass for the church will be to produce the profile. You don't get anything, at least from us, until you can show me a final profile. And it's not something that you make out of thin air. I give you more than enough examples that you can use, templates even, to insert your own information into those.
I have a question.
Yes.
I want to know, why is it that this organization, why is it that they can't hire an interim pastor?
It is based primarily upon the principle that the interim is to come to serve often a specific purpose. And that for some interims to do that, they will make both friends and enemies. Because Because in many ways, the interim is to be a prophet, not a preacher. To be a prophet, not a pastor. To speak. Now, that's not always the case, and I will be honest with you, sister, we have had in southwestern Pennsylvania interims that transition to pastors. And some have been very fruitful relationships, where both pastor and people in the pew have thrived. But usually, for example, we have a church out towards the Punxsutawney area that went through a terrible time of conflict between pulpit and pew that ended on not the best of terms. We brought an interim in who was skilled and specialized in the area of conflict mediation, and actually got the congregation and that pastor to meet with each other again to talk through some of the stuff. But by the end of their 2 years, that interim was burnt out. You follow me? Because he had come to fulfill that role and poured himself into it, but was called to be a prophet, but not a preacher. But there are those who say, isn't that still possible? Listen, we are Baptist churches. A Baptist church can do what a Baptist church wants to do. Heavens, a Baptist does what a Baptist wants to do. They don't even need the whole church to do it. But some do. But normally we don't recommend it because of the role that they are performing there. And I'll give you another example too. And that is that sometimes the interim isn't wanted to be the pastor of the church. And that can create some really hard feelings. Well, I came here and I thought that you like me. We do like you. We even love you. But we don't feel that you're called to be here permanently. And I've seen where they've gotten into the running only to be told no. And that's hard to take. When you got to stand back up in that pulpit on Sunday and say, okay, they told me I can't be the pastor, but they still want me to preach. They still want me to visit them. And so while they're looking for somebody else. So that's another, I'll tell you this. If you go that direction, we implement a whole different process. One of which is literally, if it's done right, the interim has to quit for a 6-month period to allow the church to discern, is this who we really want? Because are we keeping them just because it's convenient? Just because they're here, just because they're willing to work for what we're paying them and all that other stuff. So you separate for that. Most don't do that. Some who have found that they thrive because they're really being faithful to the process and believe that God works in that. But we implement. When a church or an interim comes to us and says, we'd like to consider the pulpit, the pews, the pulpit, we then implement a different process because things change.
Well, thank you so much.
Others. How long will this take? Now I'm asking questions for you, aren't I? Sorry. Well, I already said no less than 6 months right now. Partly because of the season of the year we're going into. And not only that, but you haven't chosen your search committee yet. You'll need to begin to do that. I really suggest a month of this before you do any of that kind of selecting thing. And then putting the profile together. And then beginning the search. So I'm saying after the first of the year, so no less than 6 months. Because even if we got all of our work done by Christmas on this end, which really is only 60 days, isn't that hard to believe? 60 days away. The reality is that even if we did that, they're not going to talk to us till the 1st of January. So even if by the end of January we secured somebody, they'd still have to give their present job at least 30 days, possibly 60. My contract was actually 90 days. So that meant that they won't be here till March. So at a minimum, 6 months. And that's if everything just falls right into place. And with the human factor involved, most things just fall. And not often in place. Others. Comments, questions?
Is it possible it might go over 6 months?
Oh, yeah. The last church, well, not the last, First Baptist Pittsburgh took 3 years. And they found their pastor in Thailand. He was one of our ABC missionaries who grew up in Westmoreland County and was ready to come home. And that's who's serving there now, Pastor Chuck Fox. He just started 2 weeks ago. But theirs took 3 years. But I will tell you, brother, part of theirs was the abrupt departure of their pastor due to a massive stroke, which created shockwaves through the church, which in and of itself took months to process. Because no one wanted to go into a search process, but his medical condition first caring for him, and then the decision that he was not physically able to return had to be worked through. So they actually went through 2 interims during that period of time to help with both of those matters. The emotional toll, because then no sooner did he get put into disability, then not long after that, he died of a second massive stroke. So, and they never really had a chance to say goodbye, both bye from the pulpit and then bye from the world. And Pastor Gary was a great guy. And so one interim was brought in to help with that, and then a second interim was brought in to help prepare them for the pastor they now have. Because early on, when a pastor's taken like that from you, you're not ready to date somebody else.
Amen.
You're not ready to make that emotional attachment to another person. So you've got to process that. So I say 3, and I mean that. That's how long it took. But there were extenuating circumstances. But it is not unusual for processes to take longer than less, because even though we're using technology today, because of a lot of dynamics that are at play. Yes, I'm sorry.
All of the pastors or ministers that you call to be, whatever, they're all through through American Baptist?
Yes.
Now,
They're through our system, but they may not necessarily be solely American Baptist or have come only through the American Baptist.
okay, so say, they call, so many preachers came and, haven't made decisions. We could call other people also, and yes, would support that?
Yes, but I would say that, and there are pastors called from outside our denomination into our churches.
Okay.
One of the things we require of them, that we suggest to the church, is that they follow the same process. That they fill out they do the same work you did.
Right.
No easy peasy getting in.
Right.
In other words, if you did the work and other pastors did the work, is that a word? A phrase? But they should labor too. And and I've worked with churches that said, here's somebody that has been suggested, here's someone's recommended. I give them the form to fill out to compare. Do your 8 match the church's 8? Do you meet the same criteria educationally, experientially, compensation-wise? Because again, you put all that work to you did all that work to put all this together. If they don't have the education level, if they were in our system, they would never have come out. So just because someone says, hey, how about, if you were doing it this way, you'd never see their name. And you've all said that as a congregation, this is our criteria.
I just wanted to know if you would support, like
Oh,
you
yes.
said you would.
We do. We vet them, and I've done that. We vet them as we would our own individuals. And also, we have an expectation to say, if you're being called to one of our churches, we would like you to align yourself with that body and with our body. And if they start showing resistance, we all begin to ask, what's that about? Are you just trying to secure a place, or do you want to be part of a purpose? Because we believe that Union Swissvale is part of a bigger family called the American Baptist Church of Pennsylvania and Delaware, and a bigger family, the American Baptist Churches USA. And that God has given us a purpose, and that not everyone sees that. That's why they belong to other groups. But if you're going to come in here, you ought to believe that's where you should be. But yes, we do support that. We vet them the same and work with the congregation. But I said, and I'm telling you, you'll get resumes before this ever gets done. I know it. Someone's going to drop off or mail in a resume, stick it in a file folder, and wait until we get this done. And then we look at those to say, do they meet these criteria? And if they do, then we look at them. Now wait, I'll come back and I'll ask her, and then I'll come back to you.
So they meet the criteria, and then what happens after that? So do they come and speak here? Do they?
And you mean in or outside the system? So we find an individual. Okay, so let's say that you get 20 profiles, and the committee selects 5 of them to say, we'd like to talk with. Remember, they've already been checked out and they're all available. So it's not like you're going to contact the 5 and find out that 4 aren't open. So all 5 are available as we know of that moment in time. So what you do then is you send your profile to them. Okay? Then they decide whether they want to take it to the next level. And if they contact me and or the chair, they then say, I'd like to meet with them. So the first thing we do is set up a meeting. Number of these today, because of geography and technology, are done online. And we facilitate that, like the call that Pastor Les is on right now. And then we bring them in for a face-to-face conversation. Often what we do is start with just a few from the committee, like the chair and maybe 2 or 3 others to have the first initial, especially if we do it technology, because you put 7, 8 people like on Skype. I mean, that's way too close fellowship, okay? And there is, I mean, I am grateful for technology, but there's still no replacement for the face-to-face. So remember I said less is more? That even when you have that first initial conversation, less is more. And there's a trust factor here that those 3 that we pick to be on the first Skype, we trust them to represent the whole. That they don't have individual agendas, that they don't have their own priorities, but they really represent the whole committee and the whole congregation. And then what we do is if both parties, then after that, we tell them, let's take a week or 2 to pray and see where we're both at with that. And again, if they say, no, I'm ready right now, I'm like, you said, wait a second. We said pray. But you take a week or 2 to pray, and then you come back and you say, yeah, we think we should take this to the next level. That's when you then bring them in and have a face-to-face. And then, and at that juncture, you can either bring just the candidate in, or especially if you're bringing them from a distance, you'll probably bring the spouse in, just to get the feel for the area. But you could make that a third conversation, which is now with the candidate and the spouse and the family. Okay? And then, if the 2 parties still think this is good, then we do what we call a trial. We do a trial sermon. Now, you could skip this stage if you wish, but many committees will actually ask us to put the individual in a neutral pulpit. For example, we have used the First Baptist Church of Crafton, that's without a pastor right now. And it gives their interim a Sunday off, and we put the candidate there, and the committee goes up there to hear them. Now, if I show up and see 20 members of the congregation with the committee, someone was talking. Because God didn't give everybody a time and place to show up in Crafton. And then I preached that morning to the 20 that know something they shouldn't. But now some churches will skip that and just do a candidate and say we're comfortable enough to bring them immediately to our own church to preach for the congregation and then to vote on them. And there's a difference of opinion as to should we vote that very time or should we wait a week? And I think it has a lot to do with the consensus of the committee. If the committee is very strong and supportive of the candidate, then that will filter out to the church even if they wait a week to make a decision. But if there is any vacillation on the part of the committee, that will play out during that week and things won't go so well when a vote is held a week later. I've always been voted on the very Sunday that I have preached. Actually, the first church I had, I didn't know that I was supposed to leave the room when they were voting on me. So I stayed and sat on the front pew and listened to them talk about me. I was very young, but I can still remember in that back corner, Jenny and Tommy Saunders sat. He was a little Welshman who had come over here to work in the coal mines. And Tommy stood up with his Welsh accent after everyone had given their opinion, and he said, "Listen, that kid," and I was only 21 at the time, "that kid is the first preacher I've heard in this church in 20 years. Just hire him." And so I got hired because of my volume, not my value. Not because of what I had to say, I just said it loud. Sister, you had, I think, something.
Yeah, with the profile that's instituted on the ministers, and the technology is hot, as fast as it is, do you send profiles of them actually preaching in the service? You know, do you have that on video at all?
Well, many churches are videoing today, and what we have done is actually taken videos of preachers speaking and put them, and you can do this on YouTube, put them on a hidden level of YouTube that you require a password to view, so that if you type their name in, it would not come up. And we've done that, and only the committee is given the code. So in the comfort of your own home, or even you can do it collectively like downstairs in the fellowship hall, watch it one night together, and then talk about what you just saw and what you just heard. So there's many churches. I mean, when I was candidating years ago, it was, first of all, cassette tapes. Some of you remember those? And then they were VHS tapes that you had to get. And now then they were DVDs that were copied. And now people just post it in the cloud and use a password. So yes, that's not unusual to at least get and have that expectation that they will provide some type of spoken word for the committee to hear, if not to hear and see.
So you said that in the search committee that there should be 2 or 3 that do that initial interview when you decide that it's
Yes.
important to go that route. So say that you have multiple candidates at that level. Do you recommend that it be the same 3 that do that process, or can it be make up different numbers at the search committee?
I think it can be different. The chair should always be,
But
can be other people as well, which gives them opportunity to speak. Because again, if the committee's truly representative, it doesn't matter who we put up. And we believe in that's another Baptist principle, in the power of ministers. So put the chair and 2 people up with the first if you want to talk to them, and then the chair and 2 people up with the second, and the chair and 2 other people up with the third. And there's your 7 people for the committee, and you've examined 3 different candidates.
Question. Through your product, okay, once you hire someone, do you all have like a trial and error? So, you know what I'm saying? Do they have trial and error, or it's just like, that's it?
Yeah. Do they have like a probation
Yeah,
period?
that's the one I want to use.
Yeah.
Yes.
No.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
normally not. Now that doesn't mean, sister, there's not an unspoken probation
I
period.
know that's right. Okay.
Because I've known churches that have kept pastors 20 years and considered them on probation for those 2 days. So I mean, it may not be in writing, but it's still there. So, but no, normally if they have been secured, they understand. Now there will be some that will draw up annual covenants, as we call them. Not contracts, but covenants that are revisited on the anniversary to say, are we meeting expectations? Are we realizing goals? And it's not so much to critique for the bad, but rather to examine for the good. Now there might be some deficiencies, but it says in the next year together, where do we need to go with this? Where do we need to go with this? And if the church is going to do that, it is good to do it from the outset and not wait till you're into the process and then say 6 months in, we're going to create an annual contract, because that creates doubt suspicion? Is something wrong? Is there some movement afoot I don't know about? And things like that. So again, that's something to examine on the front end, going in, not later, putting it in place. Because then it's made to feel too personal. Yeah.
Where do you use your fingers for?
Oh, I use those just simply to tell our region folk, where's Jeff been? And it's that I've been meeting with tonight, folks from Union Swissvale. Yeah.
Excuse me, Ken, what did you say?
Oh, I asked what he was going to use the pictures for. He
Oh,
took pictures when we
Right.
first started. I didn't know if we were going to show to prospective.
Oh, yes. No, this profile you have will be full of pictures. So there'll be lots of pictures. Pictures of you in church, pictures of the choir, pictures of Sunday school. It's a given, pictures of eating. I mean, that's it. Usually there's pages of those in the profile. But the pictures that she was asking, I took two, one of this side, one of that. When we regional pastors travel, we have a Facebook page and both a web page that we post pictures on to say, as I'll do late tonight, I spent Monday evening with our brothers and sisters at Union Baptist in Swissvale, meeting with leadership and laity as they now move forward in their search process. And then mention that Dr. Friday is your interim. And it's just a way for the whole of the region, because like Frank, our executive minister, was here in Pittsburgh yesterday. There was an event over in Franklin Park, Swickley area. They had former Steelers come for a men's event on Saturday, and he stayed over and spoke yesterday. He met with a pastor down in Greene County this morning, and by the afternoon was up over the Uniontown Mountains at a funeral for the wife of one of our pastors. This morning I was teaching at Waynesburg University, 2 religion courses, which I'll be teaching also there tomorrow. So traveled from there to meet with a pastor in the afternoon, which I did, and then traveled here to be with you tonight. Which, by the way, as I was telling Pastor Les, my series would have done much better bringing me 279 and 376, but it took me over the Mon Valley, like every 700 feet, turn right, 700 feet, turn left. I was like, oh boy. And then your phone says, no service. And you're like, okay, Lord, you led 2 million people through the desert. You're going to have to lead me to Union and Swissvale. And so, but yeah, so that's what we do. Yes.
Do you think that the criteria for selecting pastors have changed over the years, and how?
Oh, yeah. Yes. If you were to ask me, what were the primary roles of a pastor 50 years ago? The top 3 were preaching, teaching, and pastoral care. Primarily because people outside these walls just showed up. The church didn't have to do a lot of community connection and outreach because people just came. And so because of the steady stream of people, the pastor focused most of their energy and efforts, and they were primarily only he's then. So he focused primarily his energy and effort on church folk. 50 years later, there are more out there that don't come to church than that do. There are many out there that are biblically illiterate and need to be reached. And I even tell ministerial students today, having started in ministry myself more than 30 years ago, ministerial students starting out today are going to be dealing with issues that I never confronted 30 years. Oh, there were some people who had drug issues, and we were aware of them, but it was not an epidemic. There were not dozens and hundreds dying every day, month, and year. There's not a family probably in this church that's not affected by someone on drugs. We all know somebody dealing with that demon. And it's not just them. And so pastors have to have those skills. Another thing is, when I started in ministry, when I stood in the pulpit or down here on the floor for Bible study and asked for prayer, when someone said cancer, the whole congregation gasped. Today, 3/4 of the prayer list is cancer, and every week, I know for me, every week I find a new person diagnosed with cancer. And there's so many types of cancer today. And the treatments are extending lives so much farther that there's much more care having to be given because people didn't last that long 3 decades ago. So those are new dynamics playing out that come to the role and responsibility of the pastor. That where people used to come, they got to go. And they got to take people with them. And what they're going to face out there is very different today than the world they faced then. So they've got to be aware of social ills and social issues, biblical justice today. To speak into our, because if we're not speaking into the culture will speak for itself, and I'm not so sure I'm keen on what they're saying without a biblical worldview and context. So those, brother, are some of the things that I have seen. Where I would say this, 50 years ago, it was a lot about what you had in your head. Today, those are still important, but you better also be working with your hands, or you're not going to go anywhere. Preachers today have to be willing to get more messy than ever before. And if they can't evidence, because listen, you can put anything you want on your profile, they can put anything they want on their profile. It's just words. What you have to do as a committee is flesh that out. If this is what you say you do, give us tangible examples that you're doing that. Or if you have aspirations and expectations, they are be able to articulate evidence that they are able to help you realize that. Now, there's some give and take there. I get that. But on the same token, they ought to be able to evidence that if that's where you want to be taken under their leadership. Some will learn while they're here, but they ought to already bring value to the table. Volume to the table. And I don't just mean their speaking voice. Anything else? I don't want to keep you any longer, but I want to be faithful to cover as much ground as we need to. So as a congregation, both leadership and laity, you now know what will be happening. And though it will be a small group actually doing this, everyone's aware how this is going to play out. Or should be. And with the recording, able to hear for themselves what this will look like as we move forward together. Boy.
I've got a quick questions.
Did he say questions plural?
Plural.
Thanks.
Plural.
Go ahead, Brother Class.
So I was chatting with a friend of mine who had gone through a pastoral search 20 years ago, and one of the things that they did was, as a committee, whenever they found potential candidates, they secretly traveled to the candidate's church and observed them on sort of their own terms without, them knowing. Is that something that you've seen in the past? That's something that you recommend?
I've seen it in the past. I don't see it much today because of the technology factor. There still is no replacement for the in-person, but depending on where you go and depending on how many of you go, it's pretty obvious something's up when you show up. When the church in Charleston, West Virginia called me in the 90s, unbeknownst to me, the committee, with no heads up, got in a van and traveled up one Sunday morning and showed up at my church. What they didn't know was that Sunday, 90% of the church worshiped off-site at an hour earlier, and only the senior saints gathered in the sanctuary that morning. And when I came back from this outdoor service, where hundreds and hundreds were, my wife caught me in the driveway and said, "I think that church from Charleston is here." And I said, "Where?" And she said, "Over in that van." So I walked over to the van, and I told them, "Great to have you here. But when you walk into the church, you're going to outnumber the congregation, so they're going to know something's up," and they did because of that. And even they said, well, we'll just go in we'll spread ourselves out going in. Oh yeah, that won't be obvious. 2 of you, then 2 more of you, then 1 of you, yeah. And you're all going to sit in different places, they're not going to know. So that has happened. I've seen that, but not as much as it used to be. Just because we have technology that can allow some of that to occur.
The second question was, What are some best practices that you've seen as far as selecting a committee?
I may have said this when you were back on the call, and that is that the committee should be representative gender-wise of the church.
Yes, I heard that part.
Okay.
But I mean, the actual process.
Oh, are you speaking of whether people should be nominated or self-volunteer? I've seen a mixture of both. If they're nominated or select, I think I'm a huge believer in everything should go back to the congregation. Even in my larger church in Charleston, we held a monthly business meeting to allow the congregation to make a lot of decisions, because I just believe in that principle of congregational decision. So if people self-select by saying, I'd like to be on it, or if they're nominated to a list, the congregation should have the final selection. But when that is taking place, it needs to be objective, which means I might have to surrender some of what I want for the greater good of this truly being inclusive of our congregation. So I see the plus and minuses of each methodology, but if it keeps going back to the church, no one can point a single finger saying, well, those few made the decision, because it was the body.
And then what happens, say in a scenario where there's 20 people that are interested.
Yeah.
What process would you recommend for whittling that down, or for the congregation ranking, or?
Well, in the book of Acts, when they were trying to replace Judas' seat, they rolled dice, and we never heard that guy again. So I would recommend that methodology. I don't necessarily think the book of Acts meant that everything in it had to be followed by the church today. And uniquely enough, we are not told how the 7 were selected. We are told that 7 were selected based upon, and this is real important. I know that there will be some thinking among the church, this person would be good because they got this skill set. And this person would be good because they got these gifts. But the criteria in Acts was their spirituality. Because you know what? God can compensate for your lack of skills, talents, and abilities. But God cannot compensate for your lack of spirituality. See, God controls the gifts, talents, and abilities. We control the spirituality. How much we're going to let the Holy Spirit run our lives, rule our lives. So that should always be the superseding aspect to any selection. Do we really consider this person full of, they may bring all kind of good stuff to the table with them, but listen, we've all seen how destructive those gifts, talents, and abilities can be if they're controlled by the person and not the person of Christ. And so that's why I think what you do is, because we don't know the methodology, we fall back to at least the consensus, if not the majority, that we put the names out there. For example, in the church that I had here in Washington County when I was a pastor in Western Pennsylvania, to select our deacons, we came together like this, and people received this piece of paper. And because we didn't nominate deacons. And so it was just, we prayed for a while and then wrote a name down. And if enough of that one person's name was on papers, they were selected. And that was a throwback from the 1700s that they had done from when the church was founded, even before we were a country. So again, it was based on that principle. Is there this consensus among us? Because then we move forward with that. Did you have any more?
You can interject.
Okay.
A concern that I have is that usually for like our church meetings, we may not have more than this.
Yeah.
So what ideas do you have for us to get that bigger representation of what our congregation really looks like?
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, I assume you have some people who only show up on Sunday mornings. One of them should be on the committee. Because that's their church. That's their church. See, we often select only people that are involved in every aspect of church life. That is not representative of your church, because not everybody is involved in every aspect of church life. You probably have a lot of people that only come Sunday mornings, that outnumber the people that are involved in every aspect, because you're doing 2-3 jobs. but they are a segment of the congregation. I have known of committees that allow adjunct people to participate as non-voting members because they are non-members. But still, they are more supportive of the church than some of the members you got on the rolls. That never show their faces. That never put money in the plate. That never fill the pew. Do they not have some right to be respected? Because they come, if you saw them on the street and said, "What's your church?" they'd say, "Union Swissvale." Even though they're not on your roll. Now, I'm not suggesting that, but I'm saying they probably have more rights to be represented on the committee than someone who hasn't been in church for 10 years, but could say, "I'm a member."
We have people who tithe and hear the messages that are sick and shut in, and you saying that makes me think about them as well.
Yes. Because, again, they ought to be representative of the body. Because when that candidate meets with them, he ought to see the face, not faces, the face of the church. Cumulatively put together in that composite that is the committee.
This is for you. You're with the American Baptist, and you used to be the pastor of a church. I don't know how many. But what made you want to do this type of work and be over a church and do?
Am I being interviewed?
And this is stuff I've been reading. I'm just trying to clear my head. What made you want to be with the association that you're with, as far as doing your ministry as a minister, over being over a church? And you know how back when there was the church, and then God had the priest, and they only served 1 year. And God said the priest could preach or be over the congregation more than 1 year. So what made you feel that, I know you felt like growth and everything. So what made you feel not to be a pastor?
It was a self-awareness of the gifts, talents, and abilities that God had given me that could be used to have a greater impact for the kingdom in more than just one congregation. Both because of some evangelistic gifts that I have, that if that's all you exercise in a local church, you will wear your people out. I mean, if every Sunday is gospel preaching Sunday, and you just keep calling people only to salvation, and yet the majority of your church has already made that faith commitment, you will wear them out. And so that's one aspect of what God, I believe, clearly has given me to do, is to be an evangelist, and an evangelist travels to have a wider impact for the kingdom of God.
So you're saying that where he says that the different gifts that he gives some preachers and evangelists, all that, even though it is considered a gift from God, but it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be done in one church.
Right. And it was the opportunity. When I went into ministry, I thought everyone went into one local church. I thought that was the only kind of ministry there was. But in the years that I've been doing ministry, God can make ministry so many different things than just one singular pulpit ministry. And I saw that played out both in the work I do nationally, because I'll fly out of Pittsburgh on Wednesday, actually, to go to South Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming to do meetings there, as I just came from Winston-Salem, South Carolina, and Philadelphia. But then, on the same token, work with local congregations like yourself and these others because of that aspect of the gifts, talents, and abilities I believe that God has provided me. All formed in fashion within the local church. But I will tell you this, sister, of all the titles that I have had, and all the honorary things that I've held, pastor has always been the dearest. And there are still people who have been under my leadership who still call me pastor, but those were ones of whom I was their pastor, and I still consider that the best title. Actually, to be honest with you, the best title is husband and father. But, professionally speaking, it is pastor. Yes, you had your hand up, did you? Anyone else?
Last question I had written down was just if you had any list of warnings for a church that's going through a process such as this.
Probably the only warning I would give you is if you think about it, don't do it. Don't do it. And I don't mean don't do the search. I mean don't get ahead of God. Don't get ahead of God. Don't force God's hand. Don't push your agenda. Don't do it. Because we will get antsy, we will get anxious, and the humanness of us will take over. And that's why, hear me when I say don't do it. You know, I grew up under this mantra, if it's doubtful, don't do it. If it creates doubt, don't do it. And really, for now, that would be my only warning. Don't get ahead of God. Trust the process. Believe that God has a plan, even if God's not on our timetable. And by the way, if any of you have issues with patience, deal with it now, otherwise it will make the search process longer, because God will want to deal with your patience matters. So hurry up and deal with your patience issues, okay? Because otherwise God will stretch this out further, just for that one brother or sister to work through that, okay? But it will test your patience, I'm just being honest with you, because we want it done like this. But remember, we are people of eternity. We got forever here.
Amen.
You will never read where Jesus was ever in a rush. It never says in the Gospels, he ran. And if there was anybody that had a lot to do, it was Jesus. But he never hurried. And he was saving the whole world. So unless we're saving the world too, and I think that job's been done, there is nothing that should push us any faster than the pace Jesus himself went. Because when it does, we make it about us and not about him.
Well, the teacher in me says I should ask you this question. I'm assuming this meeting is not confidential.
No.
Okay. So my nosy wife will say, what did you talk about? What should I talk about?
Get a copy of the tape from Les.
Now your wife is going to slap your hand.
Well, my hope is that tonight we're all on the same page, especially and not even all the critical core of the churches here. I know that. People have other responsibilities and obligations and duties. But hopefully we have been transparent enough that we all have some idea of where we're going. There will be a point when the information does shut down as to total transparency, and what we will advocate once the committee is formed is that once a month the chair or a member of the committee gets up before the church and gives a report. In generic terms, that right now we're putting our profile together. Right now we're receiving resumes from Dr. Johnson. Right now we're looking at a half dozen potential candidates. Right now, what's that? Oh yeah, no, that's the critical, because the diaconate should be getting up to do that, like, straight away. But then the chair gets up, or a member of the committee, every month and reports out, same Sunday if possible, so people will know that that report is coming. And again, what we do is we make that report available. Do you record the Sunday services? Okay? It's because we say, remember, not everybody's here every Sunday, so that way a person can catch it a week later. But again, that's where the information comes from, to keep the church informed. Okay? Oh, is that- I thank you for taking time to be here tonight. I know you could have been anywhere else, and you considered this not just important but imperative enough to take your valuable time to be present. And so I thank you for that, and I have to believe that God is pleased, because it expresses to God that this matters to you, that this matters. So, may I close us in prayer? Lord, I do thank you for allowing these dear brothers and sisters to join with me in this evening. It's time to seek your face. And we ask, Lord, that you will make your path clear to us, and that there will be nothing that deters us from fulfilling and experience the fulfillment of your will. We rebuke the enemy that will seek to attack this congregation now that they're on the search for their next pastor. And we know that the enemy can appear even as an angel of light in masquerade. But we want nothing but the real deal, Lord, from you for this pastorate of this church. And so we claim this space for you, Jesus, and rebuke the enemy that would seek to bring this congregation, as he seeks to bring all congregations, to their knees. And if he does that, on our knees we'll pray even harder than we did before. We seek your face. We desire to do your will. Prepare even now that pastor who will eventually be called. Put a hedge of protection around that individual, because the enemy will be on the hunt of that person as well. Because when you think of putting God's people with God's pastor, even the gates of hell cannot stand against that united front. And so we know the enemy is going to be proactive. But greater is he that is in us than he that is in this world. Bless these people and this congregation.